Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke Media briefing on the challenges facing the US and the world in 2021. I'm Greg Phillips with Duke Communications. We have three Duke scholars with us today to discuss threats to this country's national security, what we can expect, and how we might hope the Biden administration will address them. With us today is Sue Gordon. She's a former US Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. She's currently teaching courses at Duke on political science and public policy, including national security and leadership in the public sphere. Good morning.
Morning.
Also joining us is Simon Miles. He's an assistant professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke, where he studies Russia and the former Soviet Union. He is the author of Engaging the Evil Empire, an account of how Washington and Moscow overcame their differences to end the Cold War. Good morning to you.
Morning.
And we have David Shanzer. He is a professor of the practice at the Sanford School and director of the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security. He was the Democratic Staff Director for the House of Representatives Committee on Homeland Security from 2003 to 2005 and worked on the staffs of several US senators, including President Joe Biden. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Greg.
And David Shanzer, we'll start with you. Intelligence professionals have been warning of the threat of domestic terrorism for many years, and several strands of it manifested, of course, in the Capitol insurrection we saw earlier this month. Now that it's seen more widely as an extant threat, what steps can and should be taken to address it?
Well, first of all, it's very important not to allow these movements to repeat the success of the Capitol. And I think law enforcement was not caught off guard again. And a lot of the protests, or didn't even materialize because I think there was a real deterrent in having the appropriate amount of law enforcement. National Guard, of course, the inauguration was buttoned up and there was, it went off without a hitch. All those things were good. Second of all, the way to deal with the violence, again, let me just make clear, protests, pro-Trump political movements, people who want to continue to argue about whether the election was stolen or not. It's not really healthy for our democracy, but it's a perfectly legitimate activity. It's when these activities foment violence that it becomes a national security threat. So the way to deal with that inside the United States is aggressive law enforcement. And I really believe that the FBI has an obligation and a duty to pursue these cases to the greatest extent permissible by law. And that includes even the people who didn't engage in violence but wandered into the Capitol. I see there's a debate about whether they should be charged or not. I think it's important to bring charges because 5 people were killed and a police officer was beaten to death with a fire extinguisher. So people who were, involved in that have to understand that protest is fine, but violence is not. And another thing with the law enforcement is, I think it's very important to dig deep. We need to get to at least understand how organized these groups are. Do they have an infrastructure, fundraising, leadership, communications networks? First of all, we can find a lot of that out through the investigation, whether or not those lead to kind of conspiracy charges or not. But if there are conspiracy charges that can be brought, and I know the FBI seems to be trying to develop more sophisticated cases. Again, if the law allows it, great. If it doesn't, they shouldn't pursue them. But I think those can help us start to unravel these networks and get a better understanding of their structure and how deep they really are through the law enforcement process. And I'll leave it at that. Maybe we'll return to some other things, let the others get in.
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly more to discuss there, and we will do that. For right now, Sue Gordon, I'd like to move on to you. We know that the insurrection and the claims of election fraud that fueled it seem to have damaged the perception of the US abroad as a leading democracy. But what does that mean for national security? And what do you think can be done to try to repair that reputational damage?
Thanks for the question, Greg. And David, that was a really nice foundation. 2 points I want to make. Number one is one I've made before, and starting with really our realization that adversaries were interested in interfering in our election. One of the things I've said is the election is the modality, but the point is to undermine democracy. And with the advent of the digital environment, you have a speed and a volume and a stealthiness of action with adversaries who would either influence to get their outcome or produce rifts in our own society. So I think one of the things that we have to look at is what is our deterrent to that sort of mischief that is being affected in order to undermine our own democracy. And then the second piece is, what are we representing? How strong are we against the actions on our homeland that horrifyingly, if all you were doing was watching TV, look so much like all those things that we have seen worldwide, and we held ourselves up at the standard. And is that important? Do we have a standard? And I think it is. I think the US as a leader in democratic values is important, but there's a bit of black eye now in terms of what moral authority do we have. So first is, how do we deal with it ourselves? What is our seriousness of purpose? I think the 2-3 weeks after January 6th, I think showed the rule of law, showed a purposeful account, showed how we are able to, exactly as David said, use our mechanisms to keep it from blooming. That was really important. The second is what the Biden administration is going to do to make sure that we're part of the global community, that we have conversations with the free and open societies to make sure that we continue to espouse those principles. And then I think just 3, internationally, we have got to have a concerted effort on disinformation, because that is a part of this equation.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And I'm glad you mentioned disinformation, because Simon Miles, that's the first thing I wanted to ask you about. You know, this threat of domestic terrorism, this undermining of democracy has, of course, been fueled by misinformation and disinformation on social media, some of which there is evidence has come from Russia. Now, the US and Russia, of course, got a long history of waging these campaigns against one another, and social media has made it that much easier. How big of an issue do you see this as being, and what, if anything, can the US do about it?
Thanks, Greg. I see this as a really major issue, in large part because this is the area in which suits Russia's comparative advantages the best. In the US-Russian relationship, Moscow is not really interested in competing on kind of conventional forces in Europe or on very expensive, high-tech nuclear weapons. Though we can talk, for example, about New START and the INF Treaty later on if you wish. This information space is exactly suited to an authoritarian country like Russia, and thus it's why they're exploiting it so much. Now, I will maybe challenge a little bit of the element of your question, if I may, Greg, which is that some of the most useful tools in the Russian toolkit here are not misinformation or disinformation. It's just portraying really unflattering facts. And if you turn on channels like Russia Today, or you go to 𝐓𝐡𝐞.ru, which is another Russian government-controlled propaganda cum news outlet, footage of the Capitol riots that David and Sue were talking about are extremely prominent in order to discredit the very understanding and pillar and bedrock of democracy, not just in the United States, not just in America's allies, including those allies whose borders are adjacent to Russia, but also it's a useful tool at home. As a compelling counter-argument, according to the Kremlin, to those who say, we want democracy here. The response is, well, this is what democracy looks like. Are you sure you really want this? And many, many people are turned off by these images that they see on their screens. That's the bad news. The good news is, I think that we have seen, certainly comparing the 2020 election to the 2016 election, an abatement. I think there's a few reasons for that. One is being better prepared and to a certain extent knowing the playbook on the part of the US government. Another is being better prepared and knowing the playbook on the part of various platforms which are used to spread these things, being better about attribution, for example, and undercutting the utility of troll farms and the like. In part, though, kind of continuing the really bad news, it's that some people in government or who were in government were doing the work of Russian propagandists for them and spreading, in this case, real disinformation with greater efficacy and with a much more enviable bully pulpit than anyone at an internet research agency or any of those types of outlets ever could. That's going to be the challenge going forward.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you for pushing back on the question. You are the expert, and goodness knows you're right that the insurrection gave foreign governments seeking to destabilize the US all the evidence they needed without having to make anything up. I do want to move beyond the domestic terrorism threats. We've got a lot to cover. But before I do, David Challenger, I'd like to ask you about the domestic terrorism law being introduced in the House, what you make of its chances of passage, what you think it could do, and your overall take on it.
Well, I don't make predictions about legislation, but in terms of, I'm an advocate for adding a specific law relating to domestic terrorism. Now, just so the listeners are clear, there are plenty of laws, federal laws out there relating to weapons, explosives, trespass on federal property, and whatnot, that the Capitol protesters, rioters, and others can be charged with. The reason to create a new law, a new essentially federal crime that says that engaging in politically motivated violence inside the US borders is a specific crime is really to help us get at what I was talking about before, which is how do you get deeper into these organizations in a way that we can preempt attacks, especially as these groups get kicked off of mainstream communications platforms and are essentially pushed further underground, encouraging them to use encryption and so on. And I believe that if we have a domestic terrorism law, that also means that providing material support to a organization that is planning and plotting specific kinds of crimes and violence would now also be a crime. And if that's a crime, then you can get a search warrant and a wiretap warrant for if there's probable cause that an entity or an individual is providing material support to engage in domestic terrorism. Now, those are the kinds of tools that I think we need in order to get a grip and really start penetrating and unraveling these violent domestic terrorism networks that we have within the United States.
Sure, thank you very much.
Just one quick point. There is a big civil liberties debate about this law, which is why there's controversy within the Congress. And I'm sensitive to that, and I understand those claims that this law could be used to essentially try to stifle legitimate protest. But I think they can be drafted in a way that there has to be connectivity to intentional violence. And if we do that, we can mitigate those civil liberties concerns. Sorry,
Sure. Sue Gordon, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple thoughts. Number one is, even though it's problematic in some ways for the intelligence community to be involved in this because it is a domestic issue and we have kept that separation of focus where the intelligence community looks foreign and not domestically. There is a lot of experience that we have as a community to include DHS and the FBI in fighting the global war on terror. And there are lessons that we shouldn't apply on everything from the underlying culture that I think we always struggled to address in that fight, to looking at how communications and how you build it. So I think that this really is, as much as it leans on law enforcement, I don't think the solution is just a law enforcement issue, but what are the underlying causes? Because we certainly saw this. And actually there were some actions that I might argue we took that made mistakes in terms of giving groups stature that they couldn't have otherwise gotten on their own. So I think this is going to require a whole of government response. I don't think there's a single agency that has the wherewithal or all the skill sets necessary. It's some combination of including intelligence and Homeland Security and FBI. And then the other thing I would just say, and this is just a a personal observation, and David mentioned at the end, when you're in crisis, and we are experienced in the US post 9/11, you really have to watch about the escalation of government authority. And so this balance between dealing with things that are a threat to the homeland and not giving over authority that would undermine what is great about our republic and the democracy is another balance that we're going to have to keep.
Sure,
So
thank you.
I agree very much with Sue about the whole of government approach. And I would point out that I think President Biden has appointed someone in the National Security Council to coordinate and develop a comprehensive strategy on countering violent extremism and domestic extremism.
Yeah.
And I think those are good steps. Those are the kind of comprehensive approaches to this problem that we really didn't see during the Trump era.
Thank you both. And before we move on, Sue Gordon, I was wondering if you could mention, or explain, you mentioned about mistakes having been made in maybe elevating certain groups. Are there any examples you can think of where you think mistakes were made or things could have been avoided?
Yeah, no, I just think as we learned how to counter, remember when 9/11 happened, we had disproportionate experience fighting the Cold War with government action, nation state actions, governments holding the information, governments taking the action. And when terrorism happened, you moved to a much more individual, loose confederation of individuals. And we had to learn how those breathe and how those move and what deterrents there are to them. And in some cases, I think it took us a while to understand that it wasn't just countering the action, but countering the underlying messages and allure and conditions. And you just can't give notoriety by talking about them without also attacking that foundation.
I'll give one good example, which is, I think we learned the lesson when ISIS arose, that putting large-scale U.S. forces down into the Middle East was going to heighten the conflict, and instead we developed a coalition so that it was mostly local actors and many extent other Muslims who were doing the fighting on the ground, where we were acting in a very strong support capacity. And I think that was a better way to address a very strong insurgency and outbreak of violent extremism than some of the approaches that were more heavy-handed and big military approaches that we had in previous years.
Sure, thank you both very much. And that transitions us nicely to talking more about international and foreign relations. Simon Miles, I'd like to come back to you. We saw yesterday the report that President Joe Biden spoke to Vladimir Putin. There was a mention of extending the New START treaty. I'm wondering if you can tell me what you think the significance of that call was, what you took from it, what you thought deserved the most attention.
I think a few things, Greg. First, I think it's really important that the new administration made the issue of Alexei Navalny and the mass arrests of those who have come out in demonstration against his detention a priority. I think that draws an important line on how the previous administration treated human rights concerns, not only in Russia, but for example, in Russia. And the scale of these arrests has been just, baffling. I think the number is approaching 3,800, about 1,500 alone in Moscow. I was reading the Russian news earlier today, and there's a report of one citizen of Arkhangelsk in the Russian north who was arrested for putting together a protest of 4 snowmen with signs. Which should tell you, I think, not only why this is an important issue that the administration should press and should be really firm on, but also the extent to which this is a vulnerability of the Russian government and the regime of Vladimir Putin, that they see this as an existential threat and are, as my colleagues earlier discussed, perhaps overreacting in a time of but it's very clear that they don't have, I think, a strategy beyond repression and violence. And the United States should make it, I think, very clear that this matters to American interests, because democracy and civil society, et cetera, are American interests. I think it was good that there is talk now of restarting New START. The big hurdle that was floated by the Biden people as being a hurdle, at least, was the ratification by the State Duma of the law that would be that this is required in the Russian system. It's not required in the American system, and that has passed, unsurprisingly. As that body is largely a rubber stamp body. I think strategic stability for the United States and Russia is really important. I think the Biden administration would do well to cooperate where there is common ground, and frankly, this is it. This is probably the area in which both sides don't have interest in a massively expensive, destabilizing arms race. And so I hope that progress will be made, but I hope that also that the Biden team uses this as an opportunity to generate some leverage, for example, in talks on shorter range missile systems that primarily threaten American allies in Eastern Europe. I think this is an opportunity to do so, but there's a reason, Greg, that arms control has been an area in which Washington and Moscow have been able to find common ground with varying degrees, of course, and not to suggest that this is purely linear, since the 1950s, and it's because strategic stability is an asset for both. And then the final point I'll make is, of course, not having been privy to the tone of the call, but having read both the American and also the Russian readouts, and notably the Russian readout makes no mention of Alexei Navalny. It is the policy of the Russian government never to speak his name. He's an unperson in the Soviet motif. That there's not fallacious hope for a reset. That there's not a dream that Russia under Putin is going to be different because Biden's in charge. And I think being hard-headed and realistic about this is going to serve the Biden team well, and dealing with Russia as it is, rather than as they might wish it to be, is also going to serve them well. Pushing back when there are transgressions like the SolarWinds hack or the ongoing story that there are Russian bounties for the killing of US service personnel in Afghanistan, and then cooperating when there are opportunities to do so in the mutual interest. So I think that they're off to a good start, but there is much very hard work to be done.
Sure, thank you very much. It was very comprehensive. I want to stay on the topic of Russia for a bit, but I would like to remind everybody on the call that we are open to questions. You can pose questions via the Q&A window at any time. If you'd like to ask a question in person, raise your hand in Zoom and we can unmute you when your turn comes around. And if you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Sue Gordon, I'd like to come back to you on this topic of Russia. You know, one of the things that came up yesterday was the sovereignty of Ukraine. And I'm wondering for your take on that, with your many years of experience in intelligence, whether you think that the advent of a new administration could mean that Russia tries to test those boundaries, or if you have any thoughts on how a Biden administration might tackle that particular sensitive issue.
So I might argue that the Trump administration, when it took office, took what had been a burbling issue and drove it in a weird sort of way into action, but in that action has driven some sort of stasis. I don't expect it will be a huge focus as long as the uneasy balance that exists today is maintained. But make no mistake, Russia's interest in executing actions against Ukraine to make sure that the Ukrainians understand who has the power is as much of an element, and Simon, I'll love your take on this as well, as much of an element of Russia's foreign policy as anything. It's why they turn off the power grid. It's why they conduct so many cyber activities there. It's why you've seen moves into various parts of Ukraine proper. I don't think, barring a massive new Russian aggression, that this will necessarily be the focus of foreign policy in the short haul. But it is always burbling beneath the surface because of Russians' clear intention with regard to Ukraine. Simon, do you want to add to that?
Thanks, Sue. I endorse what Sue said. I see no real reason why Russia would want to take on more of a burden here. They're getting what they want and need out of it. And I think if we look at the trajectory of Russian behavior in Ukraine, it's been very calibrated. And I know that that sounds very strange when you're talking about annexing territory, but it has been quite calibrated. It started out with the sort of little green men, or the polite people, as they were referred to by those who welcomed them. As those didn't quite generate the real territorial gains, the volume went up and you saw actual Russian armor roll into Ukraine to consolidate gains and take over territory. As those gains were really definitive, the conventional Russian military rolled back into a support position. Again, I think that there's a huge amount of utility for the Russians to keep Ukraine destabilized, to keep the question on everyone's mind who might be talking about a future for Ukraine in NATO being, okay, what does it mean to extend Article 5 territorial integrity guarantees to a country which does not currently enjoy territorial integrity, both in Crimea, which is one issue, and then also in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, where it is a much more fluid situation. I hope that the Biden administration will continue, frankly, what the Trump administration did in providing the capacity building for the Ukrainian government to defend itself, including the provision of some lethal aid, which will equip them to better resist the push of more heavy conventional military in the event, I think unlikely, but still in the event that serves the interests of the Russian government. But I, like Sue, think that Russia will keep their finger on the dial, so to speak, to use a stove metaphor, to keep this at an uncomfortable simmer for all concerned, with no interest though in turning it up to be a rolling boil, which really becomes a dominant issue.
Sure, that makes sense. Thank you. I'd like to move beyond Russia and into the Middle East. And David Chancellor, perhaps you could start us off here. Obviously, the US is still involved in Afghanistan, and we have the remnants of a nuclear agreement in Iran. Obviously, the US has to operate on many fronts. But what, if anything, do you expect out of the Biden administration on Afghanistan and Iran? Do you think one of them kind of gets tackled full bore first? What could you expect to see from the US in the Middle East?
Well, I certainly think we have to act on multiple fronts and have a comprehensive approach. I think what you're going to see is a greater reliance on the tools of diplomacy across the board. We need a political solution in Afghanistan. I don't believe that the agreement with the Trump negotiated with the Taliban is going to bear fruit and bring the kind of stability and peace that would allow us to do a full withdrawal of our troops. So we're going to need to have a stronger diplomatic effort, bring in more parties that are committed to a peaceful future for Afghanistan in order to do what I think everyone on all sides wants to do, which is to kind of decrease and ultimately end US involvement there, except in a continuing supportive role. The issues with Iran are, just very separate and different and complicated. We're able to flick a switch and rejoin the Paris Accord because, climate change is continuing and getting worse, and all the parties were still many of the parties were still fully committed to that treaty, and so we could simply rejoin. The situation has really changed in Iran. Iran's internal politics are a mess. Their economy's in shambles, and they've, have this burgeoning potential to restart and move towards a nuclear weapon. So I think we have to deal with the situation as it is now, not pretend that we're back in 2015 and we can just simply rejoin. And I think the notion of decoupling entirely the nuclear issue from Iran's other behaviors in the Middle East, support for terrorism, its regional ambitions, its support for groups that are destabilizing, like the Houthi and Hezbollah, and what it's doing in Iraq as well, are all issues. You can't deal with everything at once, but you have to have a full diplomatic effort that deals with multiple issues at the same time in order to make progress here.
Sure, that makes sense. Sue Gordon, I'm very interested in your take on, from a national security perspective. Iran has been built up at various times and to various peaks over the years as a big threat to the US and the threat of nuclear weapons, which is, of course, what led to the original agreement that President Trump took the US out of. What do you expect to see happen? As David has said, things are rather chaotic in Iran. Do you expect the Biden administration to make concrete moves towards either rejoining or drafting a new agreement? Or how do you expect them to characterize Iran as a potential threat to US national security?
Thanks. What a great question. So the prospect of Iran as a nuclear state is not something that I think we or others are interested in tolerating. So I expect them to make a move to get back to some sort of deterrent to the development of nuclear capabilities. What I will say is it's a really different situation now than it was 4 years ago. What caused former President Trump to withdraw was Iran's malign activity. One of the things that former President Trump's administration did was basically sanction the heck out of him and has caused Iran to be in very dire economic straits. So the conditions for coming back to any sort of table are different. I don't think that you're going to be able to just separate the nuclear issue from all the other regional malign activities. And I think Iran has got some really interesting choices that it would need to make about what would they accept and what relief do they need. So I think it's a very complex issue, even more complex potentially than it was when they started. So yes, get back to the discussions. No, not as simply as reinstalling JCPOA.
Thank you very much. Simon Miles, I'd like to come back to you. I'd like to talk a little bit with all of the panelists here today about cybersecurity and threats to the US. Obviously, the SolarWinds hack happened recently and would have caused more disquiet in the US were the country not already in so much chaos. Do you think that heralds the prospect of this kind of approach, Russia taking this kind of approach more forcefully or continuing in the future? Is it the tip of an iceberg that we can see, or do you see it as more of an isolated incident? What is your take on that?
So I have I think a much more sanguine take on the SolarWinds story than many others. In large part because I think this needs to be understood in the context of espionage, as opposed to in the context of kind of cyber attacks. And in the former context, this is part and parcel of international competition. I would expect, I of course have absolutely no knowledge of this, that American three-letter agencies, as can get around to it, are trying to do the exact same things to the Russian government. And I am certain that the Russian government or those acting on its behalf is trying to do this not just to companies like SolarWinds, but various others who might have access to IT infrastructure, et cetera. So in that sense, it is perhaps, as you said, Greg, a bit of a tip of the iceberg, in that this is kind of just the currency of statecraft. And it fits, for example, with the hacking of the Office of Personnel Management database of government employee data from several years ago. I think it's clear that the Biden administration is going to resource the issue of cybersecurity with both cash and personnel, including senior directors in the NSC for cyber, or deputy national security advisor, I believe is the title, for cybersecurity and emerging threats. And I think that's good. I think the challenge for any country operating in this domain is that retaliation is hard because attribution can often expose existing vulnerabilities in the other side. And thus you have to weigh the utility of saying Russia hacked us with saying we have a means of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Russia hacked us. And that has costs, and that can ultimately degrade capabilities later on, as does explicit retaliation, either because it kind of consumes the resource which is there to retaliate, or draws attention to it, and thus can lead to it being defeated, or enough countermeasures being put in place. So I think that the Biden team is right to make this a priority, not just in dealing with Russia, but in dealing with various other countries and non-state actors, of course, because cyber is kind of one of the most democratic forms of warfare, I guess we could say. But I think that this specific SolarWinds episode fits in a pattern of espionage which has much deeper roots, and is certainly an environment in which the Russian government, as I said about disinformation, misinformation earlier on, is very comfortable playing in. They have a really impressive science and technology, STEM, whatever you want to call it, educational foundation in the country, both from K through 12 all the way through higher education, which they will weaponize. And I think the Biden administration is right to be mindful of that.
Can I jump in for a second, Greg?
Please do.
One, Simon, brilliant. Two, just a couple ads. Number one is what is different from a statecraft perspective is in part how connected we are, and that the threat surface isn't just the government, it also includes the private sector, and the economic impact of imprecise activity, or activity when you wanted to target 3 agencies and you got 50,000 companies is a little different in terms of the old 1960s Vienna spy versus spy. So I think just the fact that it is being affected digitally changes some of the concern because of the economic impact. And if you think about things like NotPetya, which was perpetrated against Ukraine, it bloomed far outside the intended target with lots of things. So that's an interesting question. We'll have to figure that out a little bit. Your point about attribution and what do you reveal, what do you use is another good one. But again, ever since Stuxnet, we now have an incredibly vibrant global antivirus capability where you have not the US government who is doing the attribution, but you have company FireEye, company Microsoft, who are actually seeing it first. So I think it is complex. It needs to be deterred, but being moralistic about it is probably not the best way to go at it. So really fascinating topic. I think it's a really good one for the Biden administration. I think it has to be done completely in partnership with the private sector.
Thank you both very much.
Can I just jump in here? I second the point about deterrence and punishment. Absolutely. Not to suggest that you just kind of accept it as a cost of doing business. Rather, you fill the gaps, you lock and bolt the doors, et cetera. But I endorse 100% your point about not moralizing about this. I think that's a dangerous path for American policymakers.
Sure, thank you both. And Sue Gordon, I'd like to come back to you, kind of somewhat related on the topic of the sensitivity of information. You wrote in an op-ed recently suggesting that former President Trump be prohibited from having access to sensitive information now that he's not president. And of course, normally presidents do have access to that. Can you kind of explain your position on that and what would need to happen in order for that to actually take place?
So what I actually recommended was it be a purposeful decision, not just a matter of convention, and that the intelligence community do what the intelligence community always does, which is determine need to know, and to look at the risk profile. Former President Trump, if you just look at his security profile, it's daunting. He's incredibly public. He has implied that he intends to seek further office. He has global business interests, and he's the former president who has everything that we've known, incredibly important things that are in his head. And so if you look at all that and you think about our adversaries and competitors' interests with respect to him, I would be very purposeful about deciding whether I, just as a matter of courtesy, continue to provide classified information. So my recommendation would be purposeful and not until the nation's interest was served by giving him that information. And the beauty of it is you don't actually have to make a special rule. You just have to apply the one that you already have. So I have security clearances, but clearance doesn't give me access to information. Need to know does. So apply need to know. I think you'll decide that right now he doesn't have that. If it changes in the future, for safety reasons or because he's going to advance a national interest, then you just provide him the information he needs. This is one where if you play it straight down the middle, I think you serve everyone's interests very well.
Sure, thank you. David Schanzer, I would like to come back to you again, somewhat related on the notion of President Trump and information. We know that from the insurrection on January 6th, there were a number of different strands that kind of came together. And President Trump was kind of a figurehead for that. He has now been stripped of his megaphones provided by social media, and at least for now seems to have receded into the background of the public consciousness. Do you think that the lack of that figurehead affects the kind of loose organization of domestic terrorism that we have seen over the last few months? Does it require that figurehead in order to move forward? Do you think it fades back into the background, or would it be a mistake to assume that the threat is going to lessen just because Trump is no longer in office?
Yeah, I mean, some of that depends on President Trump and the extent to which is he going to focus on rebuilding his business and his brand and so on, which are facing, as I understand it, some pretty severe challenges and maybe a lot of lawsuits, or does he essentially decide that he wants to continue to lead this populist movement? Now, maybe he'll try to do both. But if he continues to try to lead this populist movement and affect politics, and I think that there are very few restraints on him. There were some restraints imposed by being president and having at least a staff of people who at least would spell things out for him a little. Whether he took their advice or not is another question. But I think being in this very unrestrained environment, he could serve as this continuing galvanizing force, because you have these many strands of this movement, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo movement, neo-Nazis, traditional white supremacists, racists, and that didn't have a lot of commonality other than their kind of concerns about the future direction of the country and where power was going to lie. But they're extremely diffuse. And that's why we saw, for the most part, during both the Obama and Trump years, violence would pop up, but really ones, twos, individuals acting on inspiration and so on, like some of the shootings. Obviously, the Charlottesville rally is an outlier, but that kind of dissipated after the beginning of the Trump years. So what is troubling is if you have this mass movement that is mobilized by the whole idea of the steal of the election, the big lie of the steal, which is all about not losing the power that you think you're entitled to. And that's what ties all these groups together. if you continue to amplify and have a figurehead like Trump who can essentially continue to articulate that narrative, then I think you have a problem of a large scale movement that is galvanized with a leader and is building capacity and is a big problem. If he fades and doesn't choose to lead that movement, it's still there. It's still problematic and then something we have to work on. But I think there's less likelihood of it being kind of a mass mobilization of violence.
Sure, thank you. And as a follow-up, we've had a couple of questions in this vein. You mentioned about making domestic terrorism a federal crime, but what are some of the other important steps that could be taken to combat domestic terrorism, if any, that you haven't mentioned?
Developing a comprehensive strategy, as Sue mentioned, whole of government. So civics education is really, if we want to get down to root causes and long-term kind of solutions. We've lost sight of the way we teach history, the way we teach about our government, about balances and fairness and the value of democracy and elections and so on. So that's kind of a long-term thing. I am very enamored of the idea of expanding national service. We are becoming so polarized, people living in very different worlds without very little commonality. And that's why we have these situations where people are essentially living in almost two different factual realities. I think the idea of having people, once they graduate from high school or college, taking 1 or 2 years to do some form of national service, where people from all over the country, no matter what their economic circumstance, no matter what their pedigree, their educational pedigree, actually work together in teams, building trails, helping with contact tracing, public health, infrastructure. My daughter is in AmeriCorps right now, and I'm just thrilled about that. And I think giving those experiences would actually help weave the country together a lot more deeply and give people a better understanding of what people who are not like them, what their life experiences are like. And I think those kinds of things, if we think creatively about them, can help bring our country together. And that would dissipate, this kind of polarization and also this lack of trust in our common institutions that is fueling this movement.
Thank you very much. And certainly we need to be able to relate to one another better on this planet, that is for sure. And it's somewhat related to that. Sue Gordon, I'd like to come back to you. You've talked recently about how President Trump had a very transactional approach to foreign relations and that has implications for the country and how the Biden administration might do it differently. Can you explain what you meant by that and what you think the implications are for the country now that we have a new president?
Yeah, so I'm old, been involved in intelligence since 1980, seen a lot of presidents, watched the National Security Council, and for most of my years, national security was considered to be disproportionately military and political action, and the whole systems were set up in order to provide that kind of counsel and advice and response, with actors and players who kind of grew up in that community, whether they had been in the Congress or whether they had been at think tanks or they'd held administration positions. It was kind of everybody who knew what this national security thing looked like, was supposed to do, and what it delivered. And in comes at a very disrupted time. Remember, 2016 and now is a very different world because it is so digitally connected, because we are more interdependent than we had ever been. We have more ability to move ideas and money. So it's a disruptive world as we try and figure out what national and global security look like. And in comes this disruptor of former President Trump. He doesn't come from that world. He doesn't know all the rules and the basis and all the papers and theory that have come in. He comes in fresh with a set of problems. He is disproportionately economically focused. And so number one is he's thinking economics, he's thinking leverage, he's thinking deals, He's thinking finances. And it's not that the national security apparatus hadn't, it isn't that we didn't have a National Economic Council, but it is a shift when you think about the foundations of national security. So he comes in with that basis, which is both different and different. And he is also, consequently, much more, in my experience, much more in the moment. What are we doing now? What do we have to do now? What deal do we cut? What leverage do we have? What situation do we either correct or forestall? And a little bit less impressed by a history of relationships and strategies and alliances, and a little bit less focused, and a little bit is remarkably less focused on the second and third order effects of when you play out those strategies. And I think all of that is exacerbated when throughout our history, our actions had been as a part of alliances, and his tended not to be dependent on those alliances. So a very different approach, economic, transactional, and immediate.
Sure, thank you very much. Simon Miles, I would like to come back to something you said earlier on, when I'd asked you about misinformation and disinformation from Russia, and you mentioned about just the overriding goal being to undermine democracy, and that the US had provided plenty of evidence for Russia to be able to do that without having to concoct misinformation and disinformation. So what I'm curious about is, obviously the country is polarized, certainly as much as it's been in a long time, if not ever. But Donald Trump did not win re-election, which one assumes may bring some stability to this. So from a Russian perspective, do they see that any campaign they've waged is successful because the country is very divided and split? Or do they see it more as a failure because Trump was not re-elected, and thus the assumption is there'll be a bit less chaos moving forward?
Well, first let me say, boy, Greg, I hope you're right about that. The opening of the post-Trump era has certainly had a lot of chaos to it as well. I think we know from what activities they did pursue in 2020 that they were designed to aid the re-election efforts of the former president. That I think has been made public on briefings that the intelligence community gave legislators, that this was happening, and that it was definitely skewed in favor of Donald Trump's re-election, and in so doing, they were, as you note so accurately, unsuccessful. And I think David and Sue have both really hit on this wonderfully. The problems are still there. The end of the Donald Trump administration is not some panacea that's going to cure all of the underlying issues. Racial justice is still a real problem that this country needs to confront seriously. And it is and will be and has been a tool that those who sought to undermine the United States have exploited. The solution to that is not as simple as just who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The solution to that is going to take a lot of work and a real commitment of resources and effort. And until that happens, I think we should expect to see not only Russia, but Russia to be included, to try to capitalize on that to advance narratives that are in their favor. So I hope that the Biden administration will set the United States on a better trajectory in those regards. But the story is not a light switch, and there's a lot more work to do. I endorse wholeheartedly what David said about civics education. I've been very concerned that in all of the talk about the importance of STEM, the importance of understanding your place in society is being eroded by that. And as a card-carrying historian, you can accuse me of just forwarding the interests of my guild, but I do think that my guild has something to add to this beyond just being a good coder. We need good citizens. I think we do a pretty good job of that at Duke, but we can always do better.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And it's certainly no coincidence that the solution to so many of the human-created problems is education. We're getting close to time now, so we're getting ready to wrap up. But I do want to ask each of you panelists not to try and overly boil things down. I know there are a million things that the Biden administration needs to do related to national security, but I'd like to ask each of you just for one thing that you are looking for or hoping for from the Biden administration in the short to medium term. And David Shanzer, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm not sure you're going to say this follows directly national security, but I think it's so important, and that is really just a change of the tone. I think we've had 4 years of tumult and exhaustion. It's affected our national security because it's undercut the confidence in America and indeed the whole concept of what America stands for in the world. We're not perfect. I don't believe in American exceptionalism is something that the whole world has to admire and follow. But I think that took, our standing and image took a lot of blows. And I think just changing the tone and getting back to both a calmer, an approach that focuses on competence and clear interests, diminishes personalities, and is really just kinder and more professional, is going to enhance our national security greatly. And that's something I think we've seen already, and I would hope to see continue and see more of.
Thank you very much. Sue Gordon.
I gotta unmute myself. Let's see. Mine has to do with the bureaucracy. I think he needs to do three things. One, rebuild trust, not only between the administration and the bureaucracy, but between the American people and the institutions that support them. So that's number one. Two, he has to keep them connected. One of the things that happened over the previous administration is the president's actions became disconnected from the work of the bureaucracy. And I will tell you, most of the work of the nation is done, it's pretty boring stuff. It's done at lower level organizations and officials. If they aren't connected to the policy, it is really hard for them to have the confidence of the people they're working with, particularly with our foreign partners. And the third thing I hope he does is, but he's got to demand the bureaucracies be better. They're too arcane. They have processes from a different time. They have to be faster and more relevant. So put pressure on them to be relevant. Trust, connection, and pressure. Got to do it.
Thank you very much. And Simon Miles.
How do you kind of restore the dignity of the office of the presidency and rebuild trust between the American people and the institutions that serve them? Then maybe I'll zoom out one step further from my colleagues and say that I think that the Biden administration has real work to do on rebuilding trust between the United States and its partners and allies. I think all of us have found for the last 4 years the 45th president's fascination with strong men and undemocratic leaders, and very obviously being much more comfortable in the company of a man like Kim Jong-un than in the company of a leader like Angela Merkel, to be at best puzzling and probably quite disconcerting. So I think there's real work to be done on that front. I think the message has already been sent by very purposely and very publicly saying, as I think Jen Psaki did in her first press briefing, that the president would be taking calls with America's allies first and not racing to take calls with its adversaries. Like, I think the question was apropos of Putin, in fact. That's heartening. Somewhat disheartening is the policy that the Biden administration chose to take on day one about Keystone XL and the relationship with Canada. Full disclosure, I'm Canadian. I don't think that was the right step, and pipelines and things like that are going to matter. But my big message, in addition to everything that my colleagues have said, is to rebuild that trust and credibility with America's historic partners and allies, because those are force multipliers. For everything that David and Sue said, America's allies are force multipliers, and that's going to set the United States in a better position going forward as well.
Sure, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, Sue Gordon, David Shanzer, and Simon Miles, for sharing your perspectives. Next week, we're going to return to the topic of the coronavirus and the new strain and public health guidance that's coming along with that. We're holding regular briefings on the pandemic and other challenges facing the US. If you'd like to be on the list for future briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, please be kind, follow public health advice, and get vaccinated when it's your turn. Thank you, and have a great day.